Good morning and welcome to the Institute for Government. This is another event, and people here may be very well aware that the Institute takes a great interest in the government finance profession, how it's maturing. And last summer, we had the pleasure of Sharon talking about prospective changes to the government finance profession at the start of a review that the Chief Secretary kicked off at the last spending review. At the end of that, we very much wanted Sharon to come back to talk at the end of that review about the conclusions it had reached and where this was taking government finance profession. In the interim, I have to say that I was very, very personally impressed by a Treasury team that worked very openly, talked to a lot of people, really considered and tried to get to grips with some quite tricky issues that affect all kinds of organisations, not just organisations in government. And then really, really pleased when both Sharon and Richard accepted our invite to come here and talk about that review. And I think that sort of openness and that view from government that this is something to engage people in, not just inside government but beyond, in thinking about how you take forward a profession, how you take forward financial management. It's really, really welcome. So thank you both to Sharon and Richard for joining us this morning. And I'll hand over to them to do some introductory comments in a minute. We also, as some people here will know, have worked over the last couple of years quite a lot with the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. You'll have a couple of joint publications from us on your chairs. And I'm delighted that we've been able to continue that partnership and slightly embodying it. I have Keith Look here on my left, who is the Vice President of CIMA, but also for these purposes, possibly more relevantly, I think, was previously the Finance DG at the FCO, and a lot of experience in his career, including that vital experience in Whitehall. I'm very interested in Keith's reflections to kick off our discussion this morning. And of course, to welcome you to the Institute. I very much hope this will be as interactive as we can make one of these formats. Very much looking forward to comments, questions, challenges, and indeed if anyone has constructive ideas that in the government itself or indeed the Institute and CIMA might take forward, those will be most welcome when we come to the discussion part of the morning. I think we have a hashtag, which I think is #GovFinance or something along those lines. You'll read it behind me. This is a public event, so all comments are on the record, so please bear that in mind. And we'll run the format is I'll just hand over. I think Richard is going to kick off, just introduce the review, which I suspect many of you will have read, but hopefully some of the thinking and ambitions behind it that lie behind it. And then I think Sharon will probably come in with some comments before I hand over to Keith. With that,
okay.
Richard.
Well, I wasn't going to stand up, but I think I will because there's more of you than I expected. Well, first of all, Julian, thank you for having us today to go through the review. I'm not going to do lots of the detail of the review. Hopefully, everyone's read it, or you wouldn't be here. I just want to say a little bit about the background to it, the sort of broad conclusions, and I think then what the challenges are taking this forward. Because one of the things we're really good at in government is writing review reports. Most of us are very well practiced it and have done lots of them in the past. Actually taking that review report into implementation and delivering some change is the bit where we usually fall down. So I think the more in the debate we can get into that, probably the better. So a little bit of background on the review. I'd always started from the point that when we launched this review, we didn't feel like we were starting from a position of fundamental weakness in the finance profession in government. Our view, and I think the view that's shared amongst ministers and senior staff within Whitehall, and actually a lot of colleagues in the private sector that I've discussed with this, is actually, as a profession, we've come an awful long way in the last 20 or 30 years. I see one of my predecessors, Andrew Lickerman, here, who was one of the people that actually took us on that long journey. But if I go back, and I always start off, if I go back to when I first joined the government finance profession, I joined in sometime in the early 90s. I went to the Department of Health to do a financial management job introducing the then NHS reforms, the introduction of the market. I've since sort of abolished it, reintroduced it at least 3 times. But the interesting thing was that department was the biggest discretionary spender of government money. And I was the second accountant that worked there. And that was only 20 years ago. If I look at where we are now, where we have thousands of accountants across government, we've had qualified accountants as finance directors on boards of major government departments now for about 7 years. We've got 3 permanent secretaries that are qualified accountants. In terms of profession, this is fundamentally different from where it was when I joined 20 years ago. And we've been pretty successful at what we've been asked to deliver over the last four years. At a period when there's been real pressure on the public finances, actually the finance professionals stepped up to the plate on that and helped deliver. If I go back 4 years rather than be 20 years to what the challenge was that faced us when the coalition government came in and we were first presented with the numbers we were going to have to work to, I don't think many people really in their hearts believed we could do it and still maintain the level of service delivery we had. And actually we have. And a lot of that is down to the way the finance professions worked and the way it's interacted with wider Whitehall, with policy professionals and with ministers. So I don't think we're coming from this sort of position of weakness into this review. We're coming from a position of strength, but thinking, what do we need to do to move on to the next stage? It's one thing to deliver within spending constraints for 4 years. There's a lot of things we did and have done around suppression of input costs, whether it's around getting cheaper deals for goods, whether it's around suppressing pay levels that are not sustainable in the long term at the same level. There's a lot of things we did and have done around just removing some of the waste and the fat that had built up in the system in years of growth. We've sort of cut that out now. There's still bits left, but we've cut most of it out. But if we recognise, I think as we all do, that this period of financial restraint is going to carry on for a number of years, we've got to step up to a different level. And that to me was what we were trying to think of when we set off down the route of this review. So what did we conclude from the review? I mean, there's 3 broad areas that I'd focus on that came out from review. And I'm going to take the sort of structural and people one last. People tend to pick up on that first, but I'll take that last. First one was, what should the focus of the finance profession be in government? What are the things that really matter in the world that we're now in and the world that we will be in for the next 4 or 5 years? And it's really about a proper understanding of the costs of the activities we're undertaking. It's a proper understanding of the financial implications of decisions ministers are making, and it's being able to make these trade-offs between costs and benefits. Now, that all seems pretty simple. It's what people sort of expect finance professionals to do. But if you look and think about how we've approached that across government, we've not done that in a consistent way across government in the time that I've been in the finance profession. There are areas where we do this really, really well. I think from a personal point of view, I think the NHS is pretty good at this. But we don't consistently think about, examine costs of activities and benefits in a consistent way across government. I've before said, and that it's probably something I shouldn't say, but I'll say again, but there are sort of elements of excellence of this in the sea of mediocrity. And what we really need to get is that excellence right the way across government. And the key challenge for the profession is moving and making the same investment in improving our management accounting capability, our real approach to how you make decisions that we invested in financial accounting for 10, 15 years. If I look at where we went, the journey we went on with resource accounting, the investment of time and effort we put into that over at least a 10-year period, it was phenomenal. We need to put that same investment into really taking us forward the management accounting side. So that's the first, and to me, the really big conclusion from that. And to do that, you need a set of consistent standards across government. You need a different education, not just for finance professionals, but for wider Whitehall. You need the underpinning systems and consistency in the systems that we haven't actually had. So I think that's the first chunk of things. Second area that we need to focus on is how we approach the control of expenditure and how we incentivise good financial management in government. And again, if I sort of take us back to 2010 and pre-2010. Pre-2010, in very simple terms, we had sort of one control framework that was operated by Treasury. It may at times be a slightly bizarre control framework. It may have been operating in slightly different ways across different government departments, but there was one control framework. For very good reasons, this was then overlaid with another control framework that was operated by the Cabinet Office, with a different set of controls operated for different purposes. And it was really, and has been really successful at reducing wasteful spend in Whitehall. And I think there's no question when I look at what's happened the last couple of years, that control mechanism has cut out an awful lot of waste. But it can be clunky, it can be duplicative of things that Treasury do. It can at times disincentivise people from taking responsibility themselves for good financial management. And one of the issues you always have when you switch from loose to tight control is the extent to which you disempower people and you take authority somewhere else and people stop taking things seriously. So I think one of the other areas we focused on in review was how can we move to a position where we have a single set of controls that properly incentivises people to manage finances appropriately, but that actually recognises and rewards good financial management in organisations. So the sort of second chunk of the report for me was how do we move from where we are now to that position, essentially of a degree of earned autonomy, where organisations that manage their money well actually are given greater freedom. And I think honestly, I'd always distinguish on the control side between two different types of controls, one of which you want to work on an earned autonomy model and one of which you don't. So there's sort of controls that are basically, I don't trust you to spend money well unless I double check it. Now, on those sorts of controls, I think you can move relatively quickly to an earned autonomy model. There's another set of controls that is, essentially, we can only get good value if we do things across government. So you haven't got the freedom to do this yourself because actually it's not good value for money for government as a whole. So some of the controls around procurement and IT probably fall into that category. I think on those, we've got to look at keeping those, but thinking about how do we run those more efficiently and smoothly. So they're the sort of first two chunks of the report to me. The third one then, and the one that a lot of attention is focused on, is the sort of structural and people change. And the way things have worked for the last 5 or 6 years is that the role that, and I hesitate to use this word because I don't think it's appropriate for government, but the role of a chief financial officer has effectively been split between two individuals, between Sharon's role at Treasury in managing the spending side of government and my role as head of profession, as head of the finance profession, as well as doing my day job at health. Now that's had a lot of benefits. I think the fact that we've had a DG in the Whitehall department that actually has to manage finance in a big department on a day-to-day basis has been a good move for getting an understanding of what the profession has to do. But I think we got to the point where we really need to think about whether that dual model, leadership model works. The view that both Sharon and I reached was we need to move on to a different stage now. We need to bring those two elements of a CFO type role together in one individual. And you need to bring it in to the role of an individual that has the appropriate levers, the appropriate influence to discharge that function. And that means it has to be linked with the Treasury spending job. There's, in my view, been no question for 3 or 4 years that that's the direction we should be going in, and that's what we've concluded. Now, not only do we then put in the report this role of head of finance and spending together in one individual, but within that we also then recommend, and it's been accepted, that there should be clear professional reporting lines for people like me and the other finance directors in Whitehall into that individual at the Treasury. Now that's not a line accountability, I still am accountable to my permanent secretary, but on professional matters then I will have a clear accountability to the new role in Treasury. I think that will make a phenomenal difference in the way we operate collegiately and with Treasury. And I think it's hard to underestimate what impact that may have. So they, to me, are the sort of three big themes out of the report, the three things that matter. I don't think there's anything in the review that sort of previously hasn't been discussed. As Julian said, the team spent a lot of time talking to people in other sectors, other industries, other countries that face broadly the same sort of challenges, actually in different models, but the challenges are quite similar when you talk to people. And it really tries to build on what I said at the start has been successful about the way we've managed the profession. I think the challenges for us, three of them, I think. The first is this shift of focus of the profession from, and again I caricature this, but from a profession that has focused quite a lot on external reporting, on parliamentary accountability, on stewardship, really to one that is at the centre of the business, supporting decision making by senior officials and by ministers. I think to get that working consistently across Whitehall is going to be a big cultural shift that we need to make. So partly it's about getting the systems, the standards, but actually the cultural shift from that will be enormous. Second thing on the controls side, actually moving forward the controls regime and making sure we don't throw the baby out with the bath water on this. It's quite easy for people like me on the receiving end of controls to criticise them, but I also know what it was like before those controls were introduced. Now, actually, as a finance director, some of them gave me an awful lot more power in my own organisation than I ever had before to sort of keep wasteful spending down. So I think we can make changes, but we've got to be very careful that we don't just go backwards on that. And third one is the new role. It's big. Yeah, actually putting together what you will need to do as head of finance profession in helping to lead this change and transform the profession, whilst doing the spending reviews, operating the spending controls, advising the Chief Secretary. This is a big job for someone. And within that, then having this clear responsibility for, and professional accountability for a whole load of individuals like me across Whitehall. Now, to get the right person for that job and to give them a real chance of success, I think is probably the biggest challenge that we've got. So that's my brief perspective, but I'll ask Sharon to add anything she wishes, or contradict me, because she's allowed to contradict me.
I was just, thanks very much. It's amazing to see so many people here on the issue. And I particularly wanted to thank David Sainsbury, who has been the most fantastic, both supportive but also constructive challenger as the sort of expert advisor on the review. I wasn't planning, I mean, Richard, I think, has much more eloquently than me, I think, set out very nicely both as a backdrop to the review, but also some of the big sort of questions and challenges that have come through. I wanted just to say a couple of things about, in a sense, my sort of own sort of personal observations in terms of the things that I think we really need to make some progress on over the next 18 months or so, and then talk a bit about the sort of the rhythm, I guess, of the priorities over the next 2 to 3 years, which picks up a little bit Richard's point about the sort of scale of the job and how actually we maximise the chances of success. I mean, I guess my sort of first observation really relates to how we ensure that we maximise the talent pool of financial professionals across government. You know, probably, you know, I hope when, you know, in the next sort of 2 to 3 years, if anybody says to me, what's your big criterion for success, it is that we have more finance professionals who aren't just qualified, but are actually sitting at the right hand of the Secretary of State when he or she is having their bilateral discussions in spending rounds and those big strategic spending decisions. And that happens sometimes, and actually I think, you know, Richard and many others around the room today, actually finance sits centrally within the sort of strategic budget discussions, but in my own view, that still feels very much a minority situation. I think that reflects Richard's point that in a way that's part of the progression of the finance experts has been very focused around sort of external reporting and sort of parliamentary accountability. That needs to change, and I hope that with the leverage and the support and the links through to the Treasury, we can really sort of make a big push on that. The second issue, which Richard has picked up in terms of this sort of focus around management accounting, which I think links to a big cultural change for the Treasury, is for us to be as focused on the value for money of our spend as on the bottom line. I mean, as Richard said, you know, if you look back to all the sort of speeches and some of the protestations around the spending round in 2010, you know, it was almost as though we were about to sort of enter Armageddon. You know, there were no external commentators really who thought that we could take, whatever, 25% out of unprotected departments over a 4 to 5 year period and do that in a way that did not have a deleterious impact on services. That has proved, thankfully, to be unfounded. But actually, I think what the Treasury's, our sort of evolution has been, I think we've done a very good job with departments in making sure that the spending totals add up to the bottom line. I think where we have been less good, particularly outside investment spending, has been to be really as focused on the value for money of individual areas of spending. Now, it's a very difficult thing because the data and the evidence can be very patchy. And it's also the case that when you're in a political negotiation, the sort of evidence and data are part of the equation, they're not the whole of the equation. But certainly when I think about the evolution of my spending teams over the next 5 years or so, I certainly hope that when we enter Spending Review 2020, that we have got much more systematic data and evidence and management information which informs in a much more structured and systematic way, much more evaluation, which critically is the marginal impact when you're having those very tough political discussions. So I think that is a very big issue. And related to that, I think, is actually also the professionalism of the Treasury. Now, again, I think we have made quite a lot of progress from the, I don't know what we used to be called, the sort of gentleman amateur, not so many men as in the past. But actually, I think there's a big agenda both for the Treasury and for the West of Whitehall in terms of actually moving away from only a focus on the sort of general policy, political handling skills into really focused finance expertise, which is able to operate in a political environment. And that's beginning to happen. We've now got finance experts who work alongside, inside our spending teams, but we've not completed that journey. And then the last point is, again, picking up one of the points that Richard has made on earned autonomy. The control regime that we've had, as Richard has said, with the sort of separation between the Cabinet Office and the Treasury, I think has worked, I mean, extraordinarily well. After 3-4 years in, it's a very good time to review where we've been since 2010 is the most sort of logical place to go if you're thinking about the next 3 to 4 years, which is why this principle that we call earned autonomy, we now need to figure out what this is actually going to mean in practice. So how do we move to a situation where we're able to judge departments' financial management capability in a way that can be benchmarked, that then allows some, I wouldn't say loosening, but certainly some more sort of rationality in the way in which we operate delegated controls, much of which is sort of built up for historical relationship issues. We've got tight controls in places which relate to crises which happened maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and the situation's moved on. So getting to the election, I think, where we've got a situation agreed with the Cabinet Office about how the control regime is going to operate in the future, for me, is a very big win. And the last thing I wanted to say is just about, I guess, the sort of rhythm of the next 2 to 3 years. I'm always, very pleased when I leave a job that, my successor ends up doubling his or her workload. So, the job I've been doing until recently, running the spending review, as Richard says, I think it is incredibly important that we find a way to make this integration of spending and financial management work, because personally I think that is absolutely fundamental to finance being central to government. But it's a big job. And certainly when I think about how this is practical, as well as the support team below him or her, and the closing date, if anybody's interested in applying, is on Thursday. Happy to talk to any potential applicants. The key thing, I think, is how we think about the next sort of 2 to 3 years. So 2014 has got to be the year when we get all the infrastructure and the support and the relationships and the priorities absolutely in place. We have probably got until spring 2015, really, I think, to make as solid a job as possible, 2015, the majority of that year, inevitably for this role, is going to be very focused on, one assumes, another multi-year spending review. If 2010 is a guide to 2015, you know, that will run between May 2015 and autumn 2015. That is inevitably going to be the major focus of this person's role, hopefully having built the relationships and some of the data and some of the professionalism in 2014. And then I hope again in 2016, once we've got budgets set, that we can continue to really get those foundations in place. So when you know, those of you who worry that this is an undoable job, it's got to be a job that can be done. I do think thinking about this rhythm of the next 2 to 3 years is quite a helpful way into thinking about how this gets operationalised.
Thank you, Richard and Sharon, for both running through a review, but also that view of the future and where you see things going. Keith, do you want to
lead off with some response? Yeah. And I'll follow my colleagues and stand here at the lectern, just because actually we can see the back of the room. And I'll also follow by being very positive, surprisingly so perhaps, because I sat in this room on a warm summer's evening when Sharon was here talking about the review that was about to take place, and I think there was a certain degree of scepticism in the audience, if I'm honest, and indeed the report sort of squeaked out just before Christmas at the end of December as promised, but actually I thought, yes, perhaps it hasn't quite hit the mark and it's just being issued. When I read it, I have to say I was very favourably impressed. And I would say that, coming from a management accounting background and having had experience of Whitehall. Firstly, from a management accounting background, this talks a lot about moving now on to the next phase, which is management accounting. You heard from Richard, we've done the financial accounting, we can do the stat accounts, we can get timetables out, etc. We can add up, as Sharon said, to the bottom line. But it's really about what are those numbers telling us, the value for money, the cost implications, how that money's spent, not just what was spent. So delighted from that perspective. And secondly, to pull together a report of this nature across government, across Whitehall, is itself something of a major challenge. So I appreciate the work that's gone on in the background, which probably is invisible to many of us in this room, although again, SEMA and other organisations have been very involved in trying to shape the debate. So I think at the time there was talk about a CFO for government. This isn't quite that for very obvious reasons, and we have a Whitehall structure which doesn't equate entirely to a commercial structure for very good reasons. But nevertheless, it's a massive step forward. And as Sharon has said, this is in the context of really fiscal consolidation, ongoing challenges, etc. Next month's budget coming up, and indeed the rhythm, as we've just heard, beyond all of that. But there are some prosaic points that I come back to in the report, and we may want to come back to those and debate and question them later. Firstly is, frankly, the scope and scale of the role. Run the spending review is the first bullet point in the job description, and then do everything else. That in itself has been, as Sharon has said, a major task and will continue to be a major task. So there is something about how doable is this role. And when I've talked to colleagues in the private sector and indeed elsewhere across the public sector, there are genuine concerns around that. The second, I think, concern would be around the reporting line into Sharon as second permanent secretary, but nevertheless for a job of this critical importance, not into the first perm sec or indeed directly into chief secretary. And again, those who understand Whitehall and perhaps understand Treasury probably appreciate that, but to an external viewer, it perhaps doesn't give quite the right message. So again, we might want to come back and talk about that later. And then thirdly, one's trying to attract a really solid, big individual, perhaps with private sector background, who can then help this great stride forward. But actually, when you look at the salary, there are significant limitations around that, and indeed that would limit the type of person who's able to apply and do the role. So they're prosaic points, but buried within it, I think the report sort of dodges around some of the performance management issues. And I think I used to be in the Foreign Office, perhaps can be less diplomatic now, I'm outside of government, but Sharon and Richard have talked about that relationship, that tension, which has been constructive, I would say, between Cabinet Office and Treasury, and where that role really sits. And the report talks about powers being devolved to Cabinet Office, but really most of us would probably say that's the role of Treasury in a sort of CFO role, take the Treasury as CFO for government, whereas the Cabinet Office is an operational role, a Chief Operational Officer role, and getting that with the CFO in number 2 in an organisation, which most of us would probably recognise, certainly in commercial and private sectors, is something that this moves towards. And that will be around, I think, the whole question of performance management. Who is now responsible for ensuring that performance plans are delivered, performance is measured, and all those sort of good things. So as I say, with those sort of introductory remarks, the report itself does herald the next big step change, and the work of predecessors, Andrew in this room, in putting resource accounting in, getting all that up to speed. In fact, I was the penultimate qualified finance director in a department. The view was the Foreign Office would always come trailing in last. In fact, it turned out to be the MOD, with John Thompson finally being appointed. But nevertheless, we managed to get that there. And of course, the report talks about whether you do need CFOs who are qualified accountants. But I would argue that that's actually helped drive enormous change across government. And that has led, as I say, to this improvement in the statutory and financial accounts. But now it's this, how do we build on what we've seen in recent years, working across Whitehall, more collegiately, more collectively, etc. And I think management accounting would drive towards that. So CIMA welcomes a great deal of what's in this report. It talks about costing, it talks about understanding value and how to create value. It talks about business models, and that takes me back to my finance days in the Foreign Office, trying to understand what is it the Foreign Office does. What are the policy objectives, perhaps a bit harder to measure, but actually there were issuing passports, there was a consular service, there was a visa service, etc. Somehow we supported British Council and BBC World Service, etc. And you could start to cost those activities and start to say, what are we getting for that? And is it, frankly, something the Foreign Office ought to be doing, or passport services should go elsewhere and visa services go elsewhere? And you probably know the history they did in the spending review back in 2010, where perhaps the economies of scale and the expertise was greater elsewhere. But it's only when you start to analyse that MI, and all of this, as Richard has indicated, is predicated on having good management information, and there are still weaknesses in that space, we'll all admit to that. But it's only when you start analysing the MI and starting to ask those questions that you can actually start to understand where the value is, either created or destroyed or lost, and move forward with alternative decisions there. Perhaps another factor in the report that's not been mentioned is the Audit Service. It sort of appears a little bit like there's a parallel review, the Audit Service needs to come together, and hurrah, I couldn't agree more, frankly. Again, in the Foreign Office, I had an audit service that went around the world, did various things in various departments and posts. I talked to DFID, I talked to the British Council about shouldn't we have one audit service that doesn't, we're all turning up 1 week after the next in a post or in a mission. And indeed, then when some of our activities went to the Home Office auditor said, fantastic, we can now go travelling around the world. That didn't seem to me the point of internal audit in government. And actually, I could see an overseas audit function. And actually, since then, of course, the audit function has progressed remarkably, and this points to having an agency which is an internal audit function across government, sharing expertise, sharing resources. And, it proves incredibly hard to join these bits together, but it seems, again, work is succeeding in that space. The other thing that perhaps I ought to say is I'm heartened by this report because it talks about management information, it talks about data, it talks about analytics, it talks about leadership, it talks about influencing skills that management accountants need, etc. And it talks about working in a new way in government, in a shared service environment where centres of expertise are somewhere and the service may be delivered at the transactional point of view somewhere else. Again, moving into this brave new world. And actually only last week, the Institute of Management Accountants launched its new syllabus that has all these factors in there. So again, I'm heartened that we are going in the right direction. Indeed, central government is going in the right direction around all those things. But what you'll also find on your chair is something else we launched Tuesday last week, which are the Global Management Accounting Principles. And when Sharon said we're interested in knowing really what tools and techniques we'll have that we can implement, I think the answer is here. 12 principles that are currently out to consultation, so you've got the balance of, I think, 90 days less the 4 or 5 that have gone so far to comment on these. And they do talk about performance management and the performance management cycle, understanding your business model, etc. And indeed, I could see these principles becoming embedded within central government and indeed the wider public sector. We tested them out on large commercial organisations and they succeed there. And indeed, subsequently, sometime later this year, we're going to organise a tool so that people can self-assess where they are against these principles. And indeed, there was talk of, in the report, of mandating certain management accounting standards. Well, here we are working with our colleagues across the pond in America, the Institute of Certified Public Accounts in the States, defining what these management accounting principles are globally. So I would encourage the finance profession to adopt these and indeed subsequently adopt the tool for benchmarking. If I come back to the point of leadership, this is very much a leadership role. The rest of the job description starts to talk about leadership. Having this dotted line relationship in has to be a good thing. I was actually on the Finance Leadership Group, the FLG. In fact, was one of those who suggested we renamed it Finance Leadership Group to emphasise the fact that it was a leadership organisation. I was a bit surprised to see in the footnotes that Foreign Office is no longer on that group. I wonder why. But nevertheless, one has to have the finance professionals, the Directors General and the FDs really driving forward their own profession and contributing to the debate across government and reshaping that, rather than perhaps being used as an advisory panel or a consultative group. So being at the heart of that and developing the FLG is fantastic. And my own experience is, in fact, I benefited personally from what was then called, I think, the head of the Government Accountancy Service, Hot Gas. It used to run a programme down at Worthy Down in the MOD, and I went on that programme. I was working in the Post Office at the time, and as a government department then, they sent individuals on that course, and that's where my management accounting career started. So actually it feels like coming back and reinvesting in growing our own skills within central government and the finance profession is exactly the right thing to be doing. Perhaps we've been recruiting externally. I've crossed private and public sector boundaries several times. But actually that can be quite challenging for somebody who hasn't worked in a political environment or a public organisation. So looking forward, certainly we hope to see a SEMA person in the role. You'll not be surprised to hear. We have been involved in the roundtables, and indeed I did personally write to a number of senior finance executives in the private sector in Diageo, Unilever, Shell, Tesco and others who have contributed to our input, at least, to this report, and did say, could you come along and offer a bit of a private sector perspective? Because when I saw the list, it was a little bit Whitehall-centric, which is understandable. Unfortunately, they all wrote back to say they're incredibly busy, blah, 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 but they wish the report well, they're delighted to have been involved, and they'd love to keep involved in work going forward. And I know a number of institutes, CITFA and ourselves, are still helping and working with the NAO and Richard and the team around costing and a number of other initiatives. I guess finally I ought to say this in itself, as Julian has indicated, is a report which builds on other work which has been done by the Institute and others, and you've got copies of those on your seat. Finance Leadership in Central Government, or Finance Leadership in Government, is an interesting publication. If you only look at the two structure charts, there's one on page 20 that sorts the stylised structure of Whitehall finance leadership, and you could argue there's checks and balances in there, but it looks more confused than the stylised structure that you'd find in a group business illustrated on page 14. So again, work in that area. I also want to just plug and make a positive comment about the role of non-exec directors. When I joined the Foreign Office, I wouldn't have been able to make the progress I did on what I then called 5-star finance We got to about 4 and a bit stars. We never quite reached 5 stars before I left at the end of 2010. But I couldn't have got that far without the support of non-exec directors. We had 2 on the board, one of whom was very strong, well, deputy chair of KPMG International, and he drove me and indeed the rest of the board very hard in terms of our performance management, our risk management, our reporting. We have a phrase in my current organisation about no happy reporting. Any sense that it was happy reporting, things are going okay, etc. And I got jumped on. And that was good because that kept me honest. That was a person who could then talk to the permanent secretary who chaired our audit committee, and we were able to move on in leaps and bounds in terms of financial management across the organisation. So I think probably to summarise then, a really good start over recent years. It feels like perhaps a 15-year journey so far. It really feels like the start of a new step forward, a new phase for all sorts of reasons, as Sharon has indicated in the rhythm of where we are in the spending cycle. Rereading the report at the weekend, it was great to meet old friends in there, Oscar, whole of government accounts, single chart of accounts, clear line of sight, all the things I was involved in 3 or so years ago. And actually each one of them is a big project, so great credit to the Treasury team and others, the Finance Leadership Group, who've delivered all those and put these building blocks in place. But I guess the question is, so what next? Well, clearly the appointment of whomever he or she is clearly critical. The team is already, as I understand it, being established within the Treasury, and this individual, no one person can change the world on their own, so they'll need to work with others. The relationship, of course, then with the Chief Secretary is really the most critical, whatever the reporting line might say. Being able to work with colleagues across Whitehall in that really collegiate way and deliver strategic insights in public spending, I think, is the prize to be had. Personally, having gone through that regime of tight control and now earned autonomy, I think that's terrific. Those who can should be allowed to proceed and have greater scope and freedom. A focus, I think, coming next on business models. What is it the departments do? How do they do it? Why do they do it? Understanding cost in greater detail, understanding cost drivers, looking at comparators. They are there. And focusing on added value and outcomes. I talked about improving MI, management information across government. Again, work is being done on that, but hard yards are still ahead of us. And finally, I guess I'd like to see the global management accounting principles embedded in central government. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. Very good. Just before I take questions, I just wonder if, Sharon, Richard, you have any response to some of the points that Keith raised, or any of those particular ones, or do you want to go straight to questions?
I think people have been listening for a while. I think it'd be good to get some reactions from...
Okay. Who wants to kick us off? I've got a gentleman at the back.
Hello, Alan Bailey. I'm delighted to be here. I was Sharon's predecessor exactly 30 years ago in the amateur era, though we did have the Financial Management Initiative already, which made a lot of these points. And I had, in my amateur way, spent a year at Harvard studying the way the Americans use cost-benefit analysis. I understand and sympathize with the objective of trying to be as systematic as possible in the business of allocating resources and assessing value for money. And I do agree that management accounting and all these quantitative disciplines have a role. But I do think there's a risk that the business model, which is now, in my view, dominant, can be a misleading model for government and could lead to procedures which are themselves of questionable value for money. So I want to argue that there is a different model which we were applying, and I suspect the Treasury continues to apply, because the reason for needing a different model is that business tends to have a few objectives which people are all going for with a reasonable understanding, and the government is not like that. Politics generates objectives all the time in response to news and views. And when I moved to transport, and we had a management plan which had over 100 key tasks. You may say that's a typical amateurism at the start of the process, but it wasn't. They were reviewed by ministers, and they all seemed to care about things. A lot of them were safety and risk, which need about things that might happen. And I don't see value for money in the terms of performance measurement, which tend to get banded around. It does turn on, of course, costs and benefits, but they are of a kind which depend on the assessment of values, which are essentially political and will require some kind of ministerial authority, and which can shift. Health you were dealing with yourself, Richard, and that may have professionally led objectives, but what about flood management and value for money of draining rivers? These things do, you're aiming for 5-year budgets, and we all talked about that, that was Plowden and so on. But these things shift in a seriously important way, and the systems to apply them do require a fair degree of political judgment, which is why the model of dispersed control via cabinet so that departments can assess value for money makes a lot of sense.
Great.
And similarly, sorry, I will just finish. The Treasury had to assert value for money where it mattered, but trying to impose a system on everything seems to me to be, shall I say, risky.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'll take a few more comments and questions, if people could, just before we go back to the panel, just to get some more views. Who else wants to chip in? Go ahead.
Thank you. Michael Kell from National Audit Office. It's pretty much the same question, really. So I wonder if Sharon could say a bit more how you're going to crack this problem of getting better evidence on value for money, particularly on the current spending side of things.
Yeah.
That's excellent. And do you want to come in here? Yeah, just beside you.
Ian Carruthers from SIPFA. I guess in the same area, I mean, I was intrigued, Sharon, by what you said about rhythm and, you know, how you would take things forward. And it seems to me that what's being talked about here is a journey. I think that was a theme that Keith picked up. In terms of going on that journey, and really kind of picking up the thought of what gets measured gets managed, is there not a logic that if you really want to focus on what government is actually delivering, that you should actually move to thinking about output targets and shift the whole debate from inputs as we've looked at it through to outputs, and that might address some of these issues around ministers' priorities, but also putting it in terms that people can understand in terms of service delivery.
Excellent, thank you. Sharon, Richard, do you want to kick us off?
Maybe I'll start. I completely agree with Alan that it is very simplistic somehow, that the idea that you can apply business, which is in all its sort of multinational ways, is a much simpler entity than government. And I think one of the great things about having Lord Sainsbury as part of the sort of advice to the review and the number of people that we consulted is actually to try and sort of debunk some of the myths that somehow this is all about sort of translating a private sector CFO role into a world which is much more complicated and much more dispersed, and the accounting officer framework I think reflects that. I think that the challenge, and it comes to Sir Mike's question as well, is without somehow assuming we are operating in a non-political world in which you can somehow rank expenditures and governments are basically getting to tick off the most value for money ones, is how we can at the margins insert more evidence where that is really ought to drive some of the decisions. So if I look, for example, and we've got Craig here from the Ministry of Justice, I look at the discussions we have on prisons today compared with the discussions we had maybe even 5 or 7 years ago, where we have got now much better standard benchmarking data, partly because of the privatisation programme. ministers are with all the political dilemmas over prisons and the difficult issues on the sort of industrial relations side. Actually, you are able to have a conversation which starts with, actually, what are you getting for the money that you're putting in a way in which we hadn't? And I think, I don't have a straightforward answer for Mike on MI, other than to say I would want to start with the big blocks of current spending, particularly starting with the big blocks of spending which are at the moment part of so-called unprotected areas of spend. So, there are big questions I think continuing on the justice system. There's some interesting areas around courts and elsewhere. But looking at where actually you're in a relatively sort of evidence-free zone, but those will be central to the discussions and decisions, I think, in the next spending round, simply because the quantum of money is so large. My own view, and I think this point about this being 15 years, Ian's point, rather than 2 to 3 years, the degree to which we are going to make real progress before summer 2015, I think is a real question. And how far that it's about sort of getting the culture and the relationships in place, and then really making sure that the infrastructure is properly solid in the sort of second, third, fourth years of the Parliament.
Do you want to say anything about hospitals are possibly the most complex organisation I can think of?
Well, I'd actually say, particularly on there was a stage in my life when I was a lot younger when I thought there could be some sort of rational basis for the allocation of resources that was the simple ranking of saying, here's the cost, here's the benefit, any rational human being draws a line somewhere. I've grown up since then, and I know there will never ever be a spending round like that, and it would be wrong if there was. But the bit I've sort of really struggled with in all the spending reviews that I've been through is people not actually really caring that much about the cost. You can apply all sorts of political judgment about the value and what you value more. But in making that political judgment, you need to understand the cost of each of those things. So I think the starting point is, and this is where I probably differ from Ian, actually is really getting an understanding and focus on the cost, first of all, how the cost varies under different circumstances. And then you can apply a political judgment of what the value is that I attach to that thing. So I think particularly spending reviews, we get the cost side of this equation right, then you apply political judgment on the value side. You have a consistent way of comparing the cost of different things across government. And that's what I guess I push towards. And it's really, I guess, to some extent what we're trying to do in health, to have an understanding of what the cost of different activities is. You can then make different judgments of which you value more.
Keith, you've worked across different sectors.
And actually, Alan's point is a really interesting one. We didn't talk necessarily about the accounting officer structure, but it's there. It's not being proposed to be swept away with. So how does one work around that? And government, indeed public sector, is very different. It is more complex. That's why I've always enjoyed working in or around public sector. It's so much more challenging. Commercial sector can be equally political, and I think Sharon was saying let's debunk the idea that, one is very different from the other. There is a lot of politics about how resources are allocated, where the growth markets are, how people see the view of the world going forward in the commercial sector as well. So it's not a clean ranking elsewhere, as you might see. And I think to Michael's point, it is about getting policy and finance professionals alongside. And Sharon was talking about finance people in spending teams, but also you heard her talk about finance people being there when policy decisions are being taken, to question, to probe, to push, to let's say, where is the evidence? Let's have some of that. And then you can apply judgment on top of that.
Excellent, thank you. Next set of questions. There's one, I think, right at the back. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Linda Davidson from Giving World. Sharon particularly has spoken a lot about culture and getting relationships in place. And I'm just wondering, I'm very curious about the process for identifying what those cultural changes might be. It seems that the role is going to be a change agent. Change and cultural differences, whichever industry you're in, whether it's in the commercial sector or otherwise, is very different to get a handle on. It's not data-driven or evidential. I'm just wondering what your processes have been to identify those cultural changes that need to be made.
Yes.
Thank you. Got one right in the front, Andrew.
Andrew Lickerman, London Business School, but a number of other hats as well. Can I just say, I do find this very encouraging in terms of, first of all, I find it very encouraging that on a wet Tuesday in February, we can fill a room on this subject. This is, I would not have predicted this necessarily. Secondly, though, in terms of the refocusing onto the management accounting aspects and looking at value for money, that seems to me absolutely the right thing to do. And I think we ought to remember that this is not something which is just peculiar to the public sector. The private sector is very, very patchy in this area. There's no indication they've somehow got all the magic answers. But nevertheless, it seems to me that looking at what might happen now, the real challenge, and that's building on the last question, is about the cultural change involved. There are two problems, it seems to me, here. Number one, a lot of people still don't know what they don't know, so it's genuinely the question of the better ways of doing things, but this information is not necessarily widely available, and that's something clearly that is a challenge. And the second one is to do with incentives. I'm very encouraged by the move towards earned autonomy. That seems to me a powerful reinforcement to the strictures of public expenditure control that we've seen. So there's two levers there. But those alone may not be enough. And I think I'd be interested to hear what more might be possible in terms of making sure that there are the incentives there for people to make the change, and whether that, together with the notion of a cultural change programme, needs to be thought through. And I just wondered if there's any particular moves in that direction at the moment.
Okay. And just one more question, just back.
Simon Judge, Department for Education. I think just picking up a bit on that point, I think it's important to think about the links with other functions and professions. So, you know, a lot of the cultural issues you're talking about, economists and statisticians and analysts would say, you know, they have those skills, they have the mindset as well, and it's getting that mix of skills and the challenge mindset together. So I think there's lots of opportunities there for us to make links with other functions. I think that's particularly important on Keith's question about who in the centre is managing the performance of departments in the wider sense, because speaking as a finance director in the department, I really don't know who that is at the moment.
Excellent. The big challenges of culture.
You want to kick off with culture?
You got the first question, Sharon. So.
I mean, I think Linda's question is incredibly interesting and very difficult to answer in a very simple way. I mean, if you certainly, when I think about the sort of leadership of the Treasury in terms of the sort of values that we are trying to portray and distill in our spending teams and the relationships with departments, it is very much about a process of collaboration and openness. And certainly I always say to my teams, you know, if you're having to use the sort of classic Treasury levers in a discussion, you've lost the argument. Yes. And so there is something about getting to a position where it is the government's sort of deficit reduction plan or the department's agenda. It is a shared government agenda, and it is not the Treasury team on one side of the table and the department on the other side. And that's why, for me, the way in which the reporting arrangement works between the new DG and Directors of Finance is incredibly important. Directors of Finance do not work in a strict reporting line sense of the new DG. There is a relationship which is more dotted, more complicated in terms of being part of their career development, being part of their performance chain, which I think is really important, because otherwise the Director of Finance, which side of the table are they sitting, they've still got to have a relationship of respect and trust with their own permanent secretary and their own secretaries and their own Secretary of State. So I guess for me, when I think about, you know, managing the new DG and certainly helping to set the culture within the Treasury, it is very much about trying to encourage collaboration, which I think also gets into this point about expertise and experience for Treasury teams. Because actually, it is much easier to have a collaborative relationship of trust when you've got, you know, the territory a bit more. Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons why people staying in post longer in the Treasury and trying to tackle issues of turnover is all linked to the fact that you've got a relationship which is over 5 years and which is not over a year or 18 months. And I mean, Andrew, in a way, this comes back into the question about earned autonomy, because you're wanting to have a grown-up relationship with departments whereby it is a two-way street, where with clarity about financial capability and management, we're able to move to a position where the Treasury, with the Cabinet Office working in tandem, are able to say, actually, we're moving away from assurance, we're moving to a tracking, monitoring, and that's a shared information base. And that's, so as I say, I think, it's not a straightforward answer or a linear process that we are likely to see on this over the next period of time.
And Richard, how does it feel from the departmental view? Is Treasury's warm embrace something you're feeling?
Be careful what you wish for.
No, I think genuinely, I think we've always had 10, 11, 12 years, how long I've been doing this, I think we've always had a very good relationship with Treasury spending teams, actually. But what we've had is a pretty grown-up relationship. I've generally had spending team leaders there for at least 3 years, probably 4 years for most of them. And you do get people that understand your business. Some of the problems you have then is their interaction with other bits of Treasury that don't, but that's another story entirely. But it's sort of general cultural change thing. I think one of the things we need to be careful of, and I slip into quite often, is thinking that a financial management review is about the finance profession and a bunch of accountants. Big thing for this in terms of cultural change is getting the understanding of finance, of value, right across the senior leadership of the civil service. I think the critical things in cultural change is the type of people we appoint to senior jobs. The extent to which we have really got this built into how the senior civil service thinks. So one of the pieces of work we've been doing for the last year or so is actually trying to get financial management skills for non-finance people built into sort of core competencies of senior civil service. So I think part of this is a focus on the training and appointment of people. I think there is quite a lot to do on how the control framework and incentives work, Andrew. And we have a control framework at the moment and a set of incentives that actually is fantastic at delivering spending control. It is rubbish at delivering value. And you've got to sort of look at that again and say, what risks are you willing to take on the control side to improve the value side? Now, I think that's going to be an interesting debate that we have over the next 2 or 3 years. Because if we just hang on to the control thing, then you won't make a fundamental cultural shift, but it involves degree of risk. And we sort of did that a little bit when we moved into full end-year flexibility 8, 9, 10 years ago, but we retreated from that within 2 or 3 years because people sort of got scared of what the consequences was. We've maybe got to have that more grown-up conversation again.
Keith, do you have anything to say on cultural change? Incredibly difficult stuff.
Well, I recoil a bit from the sense that one would instigate a cultural change programme and label it that. Yeah. There definitely is cultural change as part of this and fundamental to it. Linda's quite right on that. But actually it happens in the context of everything else that's going on. I think one could probably get away with a change programme, although we've had several of those, and finance transformation, I think, was the last one since 2011. There are things going on all the time, and we respond. So definitely a change programme running through. I'd just like to come back, though, I think, to incentives at Andrew's point. There is something significant about where your sort of primary allegiance lies, and I've been reflecting on that recently in my current role. I worked as the finance director to a managing director with a hard line into that. It's just changed slightly, and I'm just trying to understand, really. I sort of have a primary and a secondary boss. The primary boss is much more up the finance line now, which is interesting, but I still feel very, very close to the business, and am part of the business I support. And I think that's how it should be. And actually, we're going through a process of revising what we call our DAM, our Delegation of Authority Matrix. And actually, different parts of the business do have different delegation levels, depending where their maturity is or the type of organisation they're in. So again, it's a sort of earned autonomy as well. So, you know, I think those sort of features will come across in this exercise as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Next, I think Sunita.
I'm Samita Shah from ICAW. I just want to ask a couple of questions about the role itself. Now, at the beginning, both Sharon and Richard, and indeed Keith, have mentioned the challenges of the role, and it's 2 or 3 roles sort of merged into one. That's a huge role. It's got a slightly sort of odd job description. There's nothing comparable to that role description within the private sector or actually any other sector. And then Keith alluded to the sort of quite low salary base. So
It's all relative.
It's all relative.
Remember, median earnings, Mr. Kell will probably correct me, are probably about £25,000, I think, still.
But my question then is, what is the process for finding the right person with the right skills, the respect of FDs across government, the right status, the right level of authority, and put that person into place to manage this role? The reason I ask this question, and I know that there are several people in this room who've heard the same rumours, we've heard that somebody's already being lined up from internally within government to take on this role. Now, if that's the case, that would be a real shame given the review that you've carried out and the extent of the review and actually the conclusions. We don't necessarily agree with all the conclusions, but government's gone a long, long way in coming to these conclusions. So I suppose that's the question I'm asking is, what is the process and how are we going to ensure that the process is independent enough to make sure you get the right person in post?
Should I just
do you
kick
want to
off
come
with
back on
that
that
one?
one?
I'll do that, and I'll let Sharon come in on it. But I think, first of all, the questions about the sort of salary, the authority and all that stuff. And the authority comes with the role. It's there, it's described. That job has authority by the whole nature of what it does. So I don't think some of the questions we've had about, is it pitched at the right level, should it be a permanent savings, actually it doesn't really matter. The influence comes from the fact that is the person that will lead on spending reviews, on spending decisions, advising the Chief Secretary, and will have the relationship with all us as DG's finance. So I think the authority's there, point one. In terms of the salary, I think people obsess a little bit about salary in government, and this could be, and I've talked to a number of senior people from the private sector about this role, this could be very attractive to someone who is at a particular stage in their career. Sometimes people have actually made enough money already and aren't really that driven by money, because it's a fantastically influential job. And people are driven by different things in life. Some driven by status, some by money, others by the ability to actually influence and do something important. Now, if you want one that influences, does something important, this is the right job for you. In terms of process, we're out for advert at the moment. There's no one lined up for it. If you believe every rumour you hear in Whitehall, then you might as well give up, because there's all sorts of rumours all the time. And they're fun, but they're nothing more than rumours. The appointment process going ahead, applications closed this week, there's an appointment panel that I'm on, the Sharon's on, there's a non-executive on. We're pretty clear, we're very clear on this, we want the best person for the job. We are at the moment agnostic as to whether this comes from within government or from outside government. What we want is the right person for the job.
Sharon, did you want to add
No, I think Richard has put this much more clearly than I could. I mean, this is a role which, over an election period, is essentially going to be advising Treasury ministers and government on spending through the Parliament, and at the same time working with colleagues to strengthen financial management. I mean, it's an extraordinary job. And like all Treasury jobs, I mean, probably the most important people in the Treasury are, graduates who've been in for 3 or 4 years. It's an incredibly meritocratic, flat structure. Whether you succeed in this role the line management relationship, and I know there's been sort of discussion about reporting through to me or whether reporting through to Nick, my permanent secretary, is completely irrelevant. What will matter is whether this person has got credibility with the Chancellor and the Chief Secretary and colleagues around Whitehall. And my own view on salary, I mean, 140, I mean, I guess it depends on which side of the private and public sector line you sit. I mean, if you're in the private sector, I hope that the traction of the role will be huge. If you're in the public sector, £140,000 is an extraordinary sum of money, which for most of our colleagues, is an incredibly attractive, for many of them, unattainable salary. So for me, I would absolutely switch this into, do you bring the skills which will make this role come alive? And as Richard says, the closing date for applications are on Thursday. It is a process which is going to be overseen by the Civil Service Commission. There is no candidate lined up for this job.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, and I'm sure the applications will be flooding in following their descriptions. Can I take another selection of questions? There's one just there, then right at the back, and then coming forward.
I'm Susanna from Civil Service World. I'm thinking particularly of the strand of earned autonomy. I see it seem to be two, I can't think of a better phrase, political risks around that. Firstly, that a new government might come in and say, actually, we want to tighten controls yet again, or they have their own priorities. And secondly, around you give earned autonomy to a department and a minister has a political priority which gets pushed through, which may not represent best value for money. And I just wonder if you'd be able to comment on how you might manage those risks or how you can mitigate those risks, obviously within the confines of being civil servants.
Excellent, thank you. And then right at the back.
Ministry of Defence. I want to agree with Richard and Sharon that we can definitely improve spending reviews by understanding the cost base better to provide then a sort of constructive challenge for ministers to really think through the value of what they are buying in the way that Richard described. I worked with Sharon in Justice and we got better, as she says, at learning what the cost of prison was. Is it worth £1 million to send somebody to prison for life, for murder? That is a political judgment, isn't it? Yeah. And it's a good thing it's a political judgment. Yeah. And the same applies to me in the Ministry of Defence. What is a war worth? But we can certainly improve spending reviews in the way that Richard describes, and we're doing so. We can, as you say, learn from the private sector. We can, as you say, Richard, learn from health. We can also learn a lot from local government, can't we? 20 years ago, I was working for Margaret Hodge, who was running Islington, and we did a series of zero-based reviews to set the budget, in which we listed, in order, the cost of everything, interestingly, and challenged our politicians to put them in, to put a value against them. And so there's a lot of learning from local government, I think. I don't think it's a coincidence that my permanent secretary has a local government background, that David, our finance director, has spent some time in health, that I am the equivalent of the COO, have a local government background too. And when I came out of local government about 13 years ago, just again to support finally comments made about the journey, I was staggered to find the departments didn't have finance directors. But how that world has changed. And so now our finance director has a dotted line responsibility to the finance directors of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. I mean, from them to him. So the reforms you're putting in place aren't, of course, the end of the journey, are they? No. They're a great step forward, and who knows what it'll look like in a few years' time.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. And there's one more just down here at the front.
Hi, I'm Michael Kitts. I'm a partner with PwC, a SIPFA member, and I actually came out of local government 13 years ago, so some similarities with the last question. So I guess what I was interested in is your definition of value for money, which is always going to be one that will present many challenges. But going back to the sort of old school definition of the 3 E's, what kind of interests me is the focus in some parts of the public sector in the move from economy and efficiency through to effectiveness. And you see that in some parts of government, like Peterborough prisons, the avoidance of reoffending, the work programme, some of the things that are happening in health around outcome-based commissioning and so on. And I guess I was just interested in how much you're going to focus your MI on effectiveness and how much you'll focus it on what is probably an easier thing to measure, which is efficiency.
Okay, great, thank you. If you can briefly pick up some of those points, and I want to get one last round of questions in before the end as well. So if there's things that really gel that you want to come back on, Richard, do you?
You want me to kick off?
Yeah.
Quickly on that then. I mean, I think the risks around earned autonomy, a new government may come in and want to do entirely different things and control things in a different way, but I think the fundamental principle that we're trying to get to on this, that prove you can manage stuff properly and we'll let you manage it. And I think that, I think you can keep that as a constant. And I'm not, provided you have a way of measuring people's financial management capability and assessing it, I think, the possibility of a rogue Secretary of State or something, well, we just have to manage that. I think I do want to say very quickly, you come to local government and health, and so this thing about there isn't another role like this. Well, sort of 6 or 7 years ago, I had a very similar role in health. So in health, the head of finance profession, before we did all the changes we made, was the person that also advised the Secretary of State on the allocation of resources to the NHS and was responsible for the overall financial management. It's not dissimilar, but it's taking it up to it's taking it up to another level. So there is a model, and one of the things that pushed me towards this was actually adding that model of being head of profession when you had the levers of control and allocation, and ministerial advice actually gave it a degree of influence and strength that you never had otherwise. I think, you're right in the MI. It's a lot easier first of all, it's easy to get the MI on economy, first of all. Efficiency takes you a bit further. The effectiveness gets more and more complicated. I just like to make sure we got the economy and the efficiency sorted first. And I think we're quite a long way away from that. So I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing the effectiveness, but let's make sure consistently we've got the basics right as well.
Keith, anything briefly you want to pick up out of that?
Very briefly, I think Susanna's point about earned economy, you can unearn.
Yeah.
Unearn delegations, etc. So you can reset the boundaries. I think Jonathan's point, thank you for reminding me about local government, and the report did consult local government. There's a lot to be learnt there. The 151 officer I have been in a local authority in London Borough is an interesting one, but you probably never want to press that button because you probably don't last very much longer after that. And I think the question about value for money is all about how far do you stretch measuring the costs and benefit. Probably goes right back to Alan's point. Where are the benefits? How far out do you look at those? Which costs do you bring in? And I think we are looking wider as a culture and indeed as a profession in government.
Excellent. Sharon, was there anything you wanted to pick up?
Just very briefly on the civil earned autonomy and political risk point. The fact is we do have autonomy. The issue is it's not very rationally driven. And so I think one of the issues for us is how one brings more transparency and clearer criteria around autonomy, and then it's up to the politicians to decide where along the range you then align. So I think the question at the moment is it's all quite opaque and not terribly and not as rational as it might be.
Excellent, thank you. Just final questions. I know Sue, you wanted to come in.
Sue Cameron, Telegraph. I think it was Richard who. Sorry. Sue Cameron, Telegraph. I think it was Richard who talked about the Treasury control being overlaid by the Cabinet Office, which had been very successful in cutting wasteful spending, but this could be clunky and could duplicate the Treasury, it could disincentivize people and disempower people and stop them taking it seriously. Hasn't there been an awful lot of that about?
Okay.
Sorry.
Did you, any other final questions? One here at the front.
Richard Johnson from Public Finance Magazine. Just to ask, Sharon was talking about kind of 2014 is a vital year leading up to the spending review after the next election. A lot of talk kind of about how these changes might impact day-to-day spending monitoring and things like that. What changes do you think these will have on how spending reviews are conducted? Is there any sort of endpoint you have in mind for the alterations that will happen to the spending review process as a result of this?
Okay, excellent. Right, should we go at those two?
Richard, shall I kick off first of all on that?
You give a constant fielder role here.
Well, I think my first question is actually, I think the controls have been really effective in eliminating wasteful spend. There's no question in my mind that the pace at which we reduced particular areas of spend, and I think about some of the temporary labour, consultancy spend, has been absolutely, we wouldn't have had that without the controls that were put in. But they reaches a point where overlaying sets of controls just disincentivises people from doing the right thing. And I want to be in a position where each department actually really focuses properly on value for money themselves. Now, to do that, I think you've got to create a control regime that puts the responsibility firmly back with them and doesn't sort of locate it somewhere over here. And that's a change I think we need to make. But you've got to get to a point where you can trust people to do that. And that's the key element of the review to me. You've got to be able to assess, can you trust these people to operate without this control happening? And at that point, you loosen the control.
Excellent. Sharon, did you want to pick up on spending review?
Yeah, I guess a couple of points. And I would hope that by the next spend review, hopefully we are in a position where all finance directors are all sitting at the table with more leverage, more involvement in their departmental discussions and in their engagement with the Treasury. And I think there's a second question which comes back a bit to sort of Richard's slightly naive point from 20 years ago, is the degree to which on the resource side we are able to do a little bit more ranking according at least to cost. So at the moment people know that on the capital side, so for investment spending, we essentially have got, it's not a perfect process, but we've got a process across government where we essentially rank investments by their net present value. It is then obviously there's a discussion amongst ministers as to where they draw the line, and also the affordability constraint. But at least the first base discussion is actually if you invest on this transport scheme here, you're likely to get more payback than if you invest in I don't know, building a new town or whatever. Now, I'm quite keen to see for our big resource areas how far we can go down that line without getting into a position where the data is just so hairy or unmeaningful, without undermining Alan's first point that government is inherently a political process. But I would like at least to make a stab at that.
Excellent, thank you. Just very brief, Keith, do you want to give some closing thoughts? If there's anything that hasn't come up that you wanted to pick out, or what's the most important thing to take away from this room? Maybe I'll work my way.
Actually, I think it's been a very positive discussion. I think my takeaway is probably back to Andrew's point. Everybody is interested in this subject. It generates a lot of interest here on a wet Tuesday morning. Just fantastic. I think it's been a positive discussion. I agree the role is a fantastic role for the right individual. Nothing quite like it in government. It's a pivotal role. It really can play an important part in the success or otherwise going forward.
Sharon, any final thoughts?
No, I mean, huge thanks for all the challenging questions, but also commentary today. I mean, the message I take away is about implementation. So if we're going to have a session in a year's time or 18 months' time, we want to be moving from warm words and good intent to people feeling that we have properly delivered.
Excellent. I shall pick up on that in a moment, but Richard, do you want to...
I think my only point, as one was made earlier on, is the extent we're not facing a unique set of challenges. They're different because we're in government, but looping right back to where Keith started with Diageo, Tesco's and others, I told the CFOs from all those organisations as part of this review. They were faced exactly the same challenge. They had the same debates about autonomy for divisions, about line accountabilities between finance directors and group finance directors. They had the same conversation about management information. It wasn't different from the conversations we were having. And recognition that these things sort of flip a little bit in time. So Keith's thing about his reporting line changing, in I think every one of those organisations I talked to, the reporting lines have changed at least once in the last 10 years, usually in response to a crisis. And in a sense, that's where we've been the last few years. We've been responding to a crisis and we're changing to adapt to that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone in the audience and for all the questions and comments that we've had. Just picking up on Sharon's point, we at the Institute have a long-term interest in this, and I'm sure in about 15 years' time, my numerous successors will be looking at the full cultural change and looking back on what worked, what didn't, what drove that.
And Sharon and I will be sat at the back after
Excellent. We will also probably take a bit of an interest in this maybe in 12, 18 months' time, just to see, well, what's actually changing, what's starting to change, what's starting to work. And hopefully, if we do something that's interesting on that, we'll be able to invite you all back to hear what's going on and how this programme, which I think genuinely have been involved in these conversations for the last 12, 24 months, I'm coming out of this very encouraged about the direction you're setting and the route forward. So I think we'll all be looking forward to that going forward. And I leave to my two panel members on the right. I think you're on the selection task, which I no doubt people in this room will be incredibly interested in, both seeing who gets this job, but also in supporting that person, whoever it is, in the task ahead of them. Can I just finish by asking us to thank the panel for their contribution?